Michael Riesman, ornithologist and author Dr. Douglas Pratt, architect Sir David Adjaye, and the Natural History Museum of Berlin, and many more. And Jakob has recently exhibited with his major solo exhibition Berl at Arrows Museum of Art in Aarhus, which was originally commissioned by Lass and shown in Berlin at Beckren. And additionally, his work Liminal Land was exhibited at Luma Arles for the Prelude exhibition. And Jakob was a finalist for the Future Generation Art Prize at the 2019 Venice Biennale, and he received the Serpentine Augmented Architecture Commission in 2019 to create his work, The Deep Listener, with Google Arts and Culture. Welcome, Jakob, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. So yeah, my practice by now spans many different mediums like VR, AR, spatial installations, video games in the past as well. And I also start doing like performances and work with not only overlooked natural histories, but also, it's not just natural environments that are going extinct, but also sensibilities connected to them. So in the past year, I've also started to work with singers and folklore and ways of expressing perspectives on environment that are also disappearing, and reviving those and including like singers and different performers as my collaborators as well. So I have this very sprawling practice. So for me to kind of like explain my work in 10 minutes would be kind of impossible. So instead I'll show some images. I'll just go on my website and I'll show different projects and kind of how I work. And I think that's probably how I can contribute the best to this conversation with like some design concepts, because my background is both like as an artist, but also as a video game developer. And when you work with video games, you create worlds and teams and designs and concepts. So the kind of worldview that you try to advocate for, or a kind of code idea or perspective, will ripple through everything you make. And for my work now, a project can have up to like 20 people working on it and multiple authors, writers, musicians. So it's this sprawling, unpredictable network. So I will start that. And let's see if this works. So this is me when I start a project. It's basically in an environment with field biologists and natural historians. And I often go to landscapes for, from a few weeks or to an entire year. So when I was creating this work called Liminal Lands with Luma Arles in France, I lived and worked close to the landscape for an entire year. And I worked with a nature conservation called Chowdhry, and a biologist there who has been examining the soil of this landscape for 30 years. So people who spent 30 years of their lives moving through an environment, talking about it, writing about it, looking at it scientifically, also has a very emotional and personal connection to the place that is often underrepresented or never receive attention. And that is the attention I kind of try to draw attention to. So over a whole year, I would like guide it first by the eyes of this person. He would teach me to see things and trace the environment in ways that I don't see first. And then I start digitizing different elements with what's called photogrammetry. So what I'm doing here is I'm laying in the mud and taking like between a few hundred to up to 2,000 images of one object from all points of view with a little macro lens. And then that allows me to rebuild the environment and create these like poetic interpretations of it. So the work itself, it's like a VR work for 4 people, and they enter the world together. And as they move, the movement changes sounds and textures of the environment. And everything you see and hear then are documentations of the life of the soil in this environment. And the soil in this environment, in this Camargue wetland at the periphery of the Mediterranean, is primarily defined by salt, freshwater, sun, wind, and bacteria. So from these digitized elements, I create this kind of pulsating, rhythmic experience where people are moving through the environment. And often all my work, like rhythm is key. So it usually I connect sound, movement, and space. And by using rhythm as a core philosophy, I can connect in this rhythm a scientific perspective, a narration, a song, the audience or the environment itself, or create these kind of installations where I mix physical elements, virtual reality, sound, and like multiple different disciplines. Because my core approach is rhythm, and that can kind of be anything. So that's how I kind of like create my work. And you can see here, for example, too, there are these floors, and these floors are made of crystallized salt, colored by algae from the environment. So I work with local craftsmen while I was working in the environment, digitizing it, but also recreating these plateaus to walk on with local craftsmen that live and work in the region. So this hyper-local way of working was also, fostered by the pandemic and the lockdown, which was very hard in France where I lived at this time. And it changed my sensibility from going, like previous works would be about more like traditional environmental narratives about, stories that a lot of people are already telling, like melting glaciers, vanishing jungles, sinking islands. These were like earlier projects I did, but because of the pandemic and live in France, I started thinking, oh, but actually environmental changes happen everywhere and right beneath our feet in any city, in any place. So I started to kind of pay attention to something hyper-local and particular environment sensibilities and people's perspective on these specific regions in Europe that otherwise, receive no story. There's no attention paid to them. So I went from this project in France to create what's called Bell. And this is like my largest project to date, which involved the Singer Arca, the Natural History Museum in Berlin, a whole list of writers, both like scientific writers, fictional writers, poets, game developers, musicians, and we turned the building of Berghain, which is a very iconic nightclub in Berlin, into this virtual pulsating swamp. So we turned the building into this spatial instrument. There's like 40 speakers that move sound all around you, the songs that Ake made, and recordings that we recorded in the landscape in the present, in our time, and combined them with historic recordings of the same environments, as well as folklore that I worked with a researcher on kind of like excavating from the past. And from that, we create this large virtual, continuously transforming swamp that can take over an architecture. So this is like in Berghain, but this is in Aarhus Museum in Denmark. So it's like, by working with video game technology, networking technologies, sound in these virtual spaces, I can overlay with this work a building with the virtual world. So I went from like the wetland in France, making like a more contained virtual reality experience, to this like open morphing landscape. And we also did an opera inside of it with an opera singer, which is very interesting to me because the opera singer can just with a completely augmented body compete with this entire instrument, all this technology in this whole building, through the technology, of a cultural practice of being able to sing and train your physicality in a certain way. So this is like where my work is moving more and more now. I'm looking at also like, cultural tools we have as humans. Like I practice echolocation, for example. Like, I don't know if this comes across, but like, it's like a very loud sound that you can create with like current pressure with your tongue, and you can hear the echo in an entire building immediately. So this is like something I taught. I was taught this in a different story a long time ago. So I'm trying to like fuse these folklore perspectives and more like corporal sensibilities into these virtual worlds, and the virtual worlds are made on very extensive field work, and they're becoming these projects that are more like touring, stages, immersive shows, as well as places where other artists can participate. So it also extends to like books, performances, games. It's like continuous morphing practice. So that's a short, I think, intro to what I will say about my work.
Great, thank you, Jakob. And we'll get back to regarding questions, because I've got quite a few things that I would love to bring up to the conversation and ask you about the work. but we'll move to Maya. And Maya Chowdhry is a multidisciplinary artist working with live art and installation, utilizing interactive audio and sensory input to invite audiences to respond to and create their own journey through her climate justice artworks. Maya was Ignite Artist in Residence with scholar Efi Papagiropoulou, Leeds University in 2020, extending her commission What's Eating Reality, an immersive live art dining experience exploring food justice, which was commissioned and presented at Lancaster Arts in 2018. And Soil Voicemails, commissioned for the Cross Lines project in 2020, in collaboration with the Science Museum, explores transspecies calling, insects leaving voicemail messages in the soil for other insects, humans creating computer-generated whistles to telephone dolphins, and the parallel of telephone tapping to eavesdropping by Tungara frogs, which sounds amazing. Her most recent work, Galvanizing Change, which I think is something that Maya is going to talk to us today about, a live art piece examining climate anxiety, was presented at Hulme Community Garden Centre in 2021, created as part of Network, the residency with the British Council and Digital Art Studio Belfast. And recently launched is Walk With Us, a site-specific walking app exploring climate change, coastal erosion and resilience, co-created for the National Oceanography Centre. And in 2022, Maya was part of Sustain Artist Digital Exchange Programme, a project initiated by Castlefield Gallery in the UK and the Aarhus Centre for Visual Art, aimed at facilitating explorations on how artistic practice can contribute to a low-carbon culture and a low-carbon future. Welcome, Maya, and thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, so I'm going to do a case study then about galvanizing change. And with this project, I was interested in the question of how can we create climate justice stories without triggering those implicated in the stories, and how can we create art and care for the planet at the same time. So I'm going to just do a little case study of galvanizing change from initial idea through some various iterations to the current stage of the project. Oops. So it started off being called Digesture, Sensing Climate Change. And it was a concept for a live art conversation mediated by a wearable sensor with the question, what if we embody our feelings about climate change? What would this embodiment reveal? So it's a live art walk. The image you can see on the left is a photo of what people saw on the screen. And then it was followed by this conversation exploring the digesting of the idea. And I had these sub-questions. How do human bodies digest an idea? What can one organism say to another through bodily senses? So the audience meets up with me, and then they're invited to take a short walk. They find an object in the landscape and they consider its existence in 50 years from now. There's also a timer on it, so it tells you that you've not got much time and that time is running out. And so the person is then, when the time runs out, the screen goes blank and they come back to the center. So this is us in the center, and I connect the person up to a pulse sensor, a very basic version of a pulse sensor using a microbit. Yeah, so then we talk about the audience members' feelings. How did they feel about the fact that in 50 years this thing may or may not be there? It depended what the person chose, and I had no control over that. Like, somebody chose a bicycle, somebody else chose a piano that was in the center. Other people chose a tree or a plant. I think somebody chose a dandelion. So while we're having this conversation, they are looking at the screen that you can see in the photo below, and they're seeing their heartbeat. So I was thinking about, how their body had responded, but obviously this was like quite a crude method. And so after I did that first iteration, which was at Emergency Live Art Festival, I discovered two things. Well, of course, the sensor wasn't really measuring emotions. That was literally the person's heartbeat. But I think I was kind of looking for that love metaphor when I made that first iteration. So yeah, so the two things I realized then, that the audience member actually was more interested in discussing their experience with me than that output of that graph on the screen. And yeah, some of the audience members became really emotional about losing their thing, whatever it was, due to climate change. And I wondered then, was this climate grief or was it something else? So I brought the beginnings then of galvanizing change to my network residency with digital art studios. Well, we weren't in Belfast because it was 2020, in the British Council, so we were online. So I developed this series of interactive climate justice stories, and I was drawing on my lived experience, which is depicted here with this series of photographs of landscapes that were mapped over the timeline of my life. So we've got Braemar Youth Hostel in the Cairngorms in Scotland. We've got Sonmarg here in Kashmir in India, which used to be the snow line. Obviously lots of glaciers melted now, but it used to be the snow line in the spring, and you would be able to go to Sonmarg about May. Now you can go much earlier. New Tech Farm here in Gujarat, where I volunteered. It's an organic aloe vera farm. Dola Vera here in Gujarat in India, which used to be a sea and now it's salt flats. So it's like sea level decrease. So I have been looking at sea level rise in other places, but this is sea level decrease. The Orkney Islands, which is depicted here with a postcard from Maze Howe, which is a chambered cairn, and that's in Scotland. And then finally, I didn't put a picture of Hume Community Garden Centre because when I wasn't doing the residency, there was floods here in Manchester, and I've put this photograph here of where they want to build houses in Carrington. And we had, I mean, you know, quite a lot of rain, not loads and loads of rain, and basically the whole field where they want to build houses was flooded. So that was my kind of basis of my climate justice stories. And then I went on to use an Arduino and something called a galvanic skin response sensor, which is what you can see here. Those normally have little cuffs on them, but because it was still the pandemic, I had to cut them off and just use micropore to attach them to the audience. And Max MSP to deliver, to take the sensor readings and deliver different versions of the story. So if the audience was calm, then they got a more intense version of each story episode. And then if they were anxious or excited, so the sensor measures if you're anxious or excited, it can't tell the difference between those, they get the less intense version of the story, and there are 6 different episodes, so it goes forward like that. So I presented that, this is the photograph here at the beginning, at Hume Community Garden Centre, and we also live streamed it as well. After that, or actually sort of, yeah, just after that, I was attending Sustain, which is this low carbon art making project. And really, I was really interrogating the nature of my practice in terms of low carbon art making whilst I was making galvanizing change, and really thinking about all the equipment and materials I was using, thinking about caring for myself as an artist, caring for the audience member, caring for the planet in the materials that I chose. And so this is the image that I made at the end of Sustain, which is really about the tangled web of my practice, my life, and the ecosystems that we live in. So just a couple more slides then. So after the feedback then from the live art piece, I continued to develop the piece as part of Open Light with scholar Irini. So Open Light's a climate and culture equity platform for artists, academics and cultural entrepreneurs to research and exchange knowledge of existing and emerging technologies for creating post-carbon futures. So in galvanizing change, I felt that the grammar in the stories was an approximation for intents and not intents. And so I considered if I could use machine learning, and in particular, sentiment analysis, to rewrite the stories to be more accurately intense and not intense. And one of the sessions I worked with PhD student Robert Clark, who introduced me to this model that you can see on the screen. And we explored if we could alter the emotion / sentiment of a piece of text using language models. So then just thinking about where I might go, I'm quite wary about AI, machine learning and ethics in terms of deciding whether to proceed with that. So thinking about that, for example, in the sentiment analysis, the word colonial is neutral, comes out as neutral. And of course, everything else concerned with unfair algorithms. And then I'm thinking about focusing on some soundscapes then, and thinking about different frequencies that affect humans and other organisms. So thinking about incorporating that into the soundscapes and reworking the stories with the soundscapes. Yeah, I might like to do some further work with Robert. So I'm just going to finish here then. This is the graph that the sensor produces, or one graph from my sensor reading. And I just thought about what in English we say take care. So we mean, you know, look after somebody, but I was thinking about the word take as being quite, are we extracting care from one another and other planetary beings as opposed to looking after the planet? So yeah, I'm at the moment thinking about how can we take care of everything, you know, at the same time. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maya. That's a really interesting question and provocation to leave us with, and it's something that I was thinking about as well, and so I would love to bring that back to the discussion later, and for you and also Jakob and Robertina as well. So we're just going to move on to Robertina now, and who is an artist and researcher whose work explores the biological, chemical, geopolitical, and cultural realities of aquatic environments and the impact of humanity on other organisms. Robertina's projects call for the development of empathetic strategies aimed at recognizing the rights of more than human. In her analysis of the Anthropocene and its theoretical framework, the artist uses the terms aquatocene and aquaforming to refer to the human impact on aquatic environments. Robertina's works received awards and nominations, including at Pre-Ars Electronica, Stars Prize, Falling Walls, and many others. And she has exhibited and performed at solo and group exhibitions, as well as in galleries, including at Ars Electronica Linz, Laboratorio Arte Alameda in Mexico City, Matadero in Madrid, La Gaieté Lyrique in Paris, Le Cube Paris, CTM Art Laboratory Berlin, Centro de Cultura Digital, IBIM, and many, many more. Welcome, Robertina, and yeah, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really also glad to be part of this great panel, and also it's interesting to hear also how everybody is like having their own personal ways how to navigate the topics which they're not easy, you know, like the topics about ecological crisis or ecological situations that we are now in with the planet are complex. It's never only one or another, you know, it's not only black and white solutions. There's always plenty of different variations of views on the same topic and problematic. So I would say that similar, like Jakob was explaining before about his practice, in my practice, I also do collaborate with different experts, advisors, and many times also co-authors, like other artists, which we are like interested into similar topics. For the beginning, I will just like add next to me when talking also video of a work, which is one of my first works, which kind of like framed my research. Sometimes it happens like that. So sorry, you see it good? So in 2012, I was like on residency in Izmir Marine Station in Turkey. And I was actually there for working on a research on fish farms. But in that moment, there was like huge, this is the recording from them, jellyfish swarms, you know, and it was like February. So it was like really strange that this is happening now. And then the scientists, which I was working with, they explained me that because of these changes and the triggers which they can happen, because they have this interesting way how they communicate in chemical levels between themselves, it's triggered that there was like just like these huge jellyfish blooms there inside. So there somewhere it started my research, and it resulted in two quite visually similar but conceptually different works. The one which you're looking now is like you're thinking, because jellyfish, they have amazing possibilities, some of them of living quite long, especially in the polyp stages and so on. So, you know, just like through the biological kind of excitement about their inner beings, I was curious to look into this, what would be if there would be only like connection between the jellyfish and the organ and some kind of organ, inner organ, something, you know, without human, even though that human, of course, did build it up. And the second work which I developed through that was, it's called Aurelia Pluto Viva Sonification. And by this one, I wanted to play with them, to be present with them on the stage. So it's like kind of me and jellyfish, we are performing together, because there's always wishful thinking to collaborate with other creatures, which we put them into tanks and they're with us. So how much they are like voluntary, it's very debatable, of course. But for me, it was just important that we kind of share the space. And also it's like this, that when I go down from the stage, the jellyfish are still staying there. The sound, the part of the sound which they are navigating stays there. And of course, you know, like these are quite complex topics. So, you know, I try to merge them as clean as possible, also to be clear in the way what I'm talking about, I try to convey with this, but especially with this second performance, I like to quote the words from Paul Celan, poet who was surviving Holocaust actually. And the quote is like, there's still songs to sing beyond mankind. And, you know, this is something where I like to open the frame of how to even think about the other, and how to even kind of give the space to each other. So I will share now the other work. Oh, sorry. You're here. And it's just like this, you know, I tried in my works always. So this is some kind of basis of how I work, you know. And many times comes to location, you know, but I also try to be open to the problematics which are happening there, you know, like, because, you know, as I said, I came for doing something, it started to be something else, but it was still, of course, with lots of work with scientists, like through that project, I'm still collaborating. Actually, one of my long years collaborator is Dr. Alenka Malej. She's expert for plankton and jellyfish in Slovenia. So we are still in contact with her, and then also with the people from, I was working in Izmir, and, you know, there's always different connotations. But then also, I will play a bit, do you hear the sound? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So this second work, actually, which I'm showing now, it's a bit more poetic. I was like on the artistic residency on the science boat, Celtic Explorer, which is like one of the which is one of the biggest science research boats based in waters in around Ireland. So there on the boat, I was like with a group of scientists. They invited me because I work also a lot on the underwater noise pollutions and stuff like that. But the resulting piece is actually much more poetic. I invited to collaborate first time also singers, you know, like two singers, which they're both singing Siano Nosh. It's like one specific way of singing, which is very particular for Ireland. Because with the work, I really wanted to show, you know, we have been exploring the coastal waters and also the deeper waters of ocean in Atlantic Ocean, where the basking shark was constantly gliding around us also, and then also other creatures, because we saw also lots of deep sea creatures because we had like special cameras on the boat and so on. So it was like at the same time exciting for me to be finally on something like that, you know, because this is like my favorite thing to do in my way of working, is to spend lots of time in field, because I think it's important to get this kind of connection. But then also I wanted to speak about this, how we with this commoditization of and industrialization of the oceans and seas, we sometimes forget that there is lots of cultural patterns also very connected with it, of course. And especially this kind of singing of Siano Nos, I will stop talking a bit and I will let them sing a bit, and then I will speak more. So the song is actually 42 minutes long, so of course we will not listen to all that. But just as a vibe, you know, so there is a space, it's like 3D sound in the space. I work a lot, many times with different multi-channel speaking systems, like as in Monon in Berlin, they have like this amazing 48 speaker system, which I was able to work with and so on. Because I think it's also good to think about 3D dimensional ways of sound the same way how we hear it also, just to convey that. So in general, what I try to do is like, you know, these are two very different examples of my work, you know, but both of them, they're resulting from this very rigorous way of research. Many times I do also lots of in vitro experimentations in the laboratories, the same as I'm working also a lot on in situ exploratory practices in spaces and places, you know, and this kind of installation, just to refer to the time which we all went through, it was presented actually in 2021 last year, because first I did just radio piece because I couldn't go physically anymore back to Ireland to present the work. And, you know, instead of being frustrated, I said, let's work with that, you know, and it was first as a radio piece. And then the second stage is this kind of installation, which gives the space to the people that you can come in, be there, go out. And it was presented in Slovenia in one big venue, Kino Šiška, which is like one of the biggest concert venues which we have, because we wanted to have space because of the corona regulations and so on also. So it was also interesting to have this kind of emptiness in the theater and how to deal with that also, you know, because mostly we are always craving for having lots of people around us, you know, to show this kind of massive audience. But sometimes I think it's interesting to rediscover our works also in different ways. So with this, I would kind of like finish my presentation, and I think it's also because I think we all have lots to say on many different topics. So I think it will be also lovely to continue with the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Robertina. So yeah, thank you also, Maya and Jakob, for your presentations and for sharing like part of your work here today. I mean, I've got so many things like that come to mind after seeing listening to you, and I'm sure everyone else will have as well. And I also just wanted to just mention a reminder that people who are watching the live stream are welcome to post questions for our conversation, and I'm sure you will have for each other as well. So you're also welcome to kind of so it's not a one way. But if I can just start with like thinking about this question of care, like that, if I may go back to it, because all of you work with in different ways, but also with different agents, whether these are like human or non-human. And I'm very interested in like the work that you are doing in terms of like how you approach rich relationships, and like how do you convey like what happens there, and these kind of exchanges like to wider audiences, and like what can people, I guess, learn from how you are working with other collaborators, you are working with communities as well, but also with people who are often, they might be agents in your work, but or people who might be a bit hidden or like not not as prominent agents as like others. So I would love to hear a bit more about your approach in these collaborations, and how like it makes you think about these exchanges, relationships, and what we mean as very well Maya put it in terms of care, and how we think about care, and like who cares for whom as well, and is it just human, for example, if we're talking about non-human agents as well. So I don't know who wants to go, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of a broad question as well, but maybe hopefully it will take us to other directions as well. So feel free to jump in. I don't know who wants to start, like with any kind of thoughts on that.
Okay, we're all very polite, I think. Huh? So we're caring. So that's good. But I think we can all open the microphone and also debate, because this question, who cares for whom, it's very complex, like to rethink like who, always when we are in this kind of way of like patronizing as us humans, patronizing the nature, I call it that, I'm always questioning, if this is the only way how we can work, because when I'm in the field, or when I'm out there somewhere, or in the ocean, or wherever, there is so much care for each other. But then also like there is, of course, in between there is like food chain happening. So there's species eating other species, or, there's many different things happening. So it's not only one-dimensional way of thinking of the care, like also caring is maybe, not removing, like to be careful that biodiversity is not disappearing, so the food chain is still working, and it sounds like really brutal, but it's also true, so this care has many different connotations. Jakob, I see that you open.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying before, Robertina, on like there are many different approaches. So like the concept of care, for me, it's like, I mean, first of all, I think that I'm like, my strength is being an artist, for example. So when it comes to care, like, and I've become aware of this over the years, it's like I have the discourse, I have the history and the narrative, but my strength as a creator is being able to like really care for the sensibility of the work, so that people like sometimes spend like 2-3 hours with the work, or they send me letters and it moves them in some strange way, right? So for me, it's like I work with technology, but I have total screen fatigue, for example. So what I tell myself is that like, oh, it kind of makes sense to do it because these technologies are so pervasive today. By inserting another form of sensibility, I'm participating in offering another way of perceiving or giving some perspective on the world to my audience. Like I have like a followers, like a kind of audience that follow my work. So the way I think about it is like increasingly over the past few years with like care, there are two different ways where one is sort of, I really care for what I make. So I would spend an incredible amount of time creating just like one image, one like animation of a plant. And I'd really care for and craft with my collaborators and really build little stories and places in the larger projects where they can unfold their own sensibility as themselves, responding to the greater theme of the work. So for me, that's like how I express kind of like care. For me, it translates to not just having a concept, transforming it into something and like putting it out there, but by having like a real slow sensibility that communicates something, very emotional to people. So for me, for example, is like, I realized that that's a strength I have to work in that way, where maybe other artists are more strong at having an explicit narrative you can kind of like latch onto in an action. Like I really like what you were saying, Robertina, is like, if you look at the cultural response to, changing climates and fostering new perspectives, it's a total ecosystem of different practitioners. Mm-hmm. There's no one way of making it. So increasingly, I've become aware that I can make something that is like really slow, crafted, and brings a real, it's hard to explain, right? But that's what I mean, like in a traditional sense, like I'm an artist first. And I've learned that over the past, I think since the pandemic, I've become more and more aware of this after lockdown and everything. Yeah, and then with collaborators, I mean, there are different people, right? There are like creators I work with that's, like a programmer that just want to be in the back and like program, and he thinks that's exciting and it's kind of like a job, and it's an interesting job for him, but he doesn't want to be like an upfront kind of creator. For other artists I'd work with, typically I'd create with people from other disciplines. So I'd work with someone that's an expert at doing something already and allow them to unfold something I know through personal conversations they might be curious to explore further in response to a greater theme or story of one of the worlds I make, the landscapes. So they're kind of like relatively themselves within that work. And then they're super present, their credits, their voice. It's kind of, they have ownership over their own work within that world. And I also work with like small teams over long periods of time rather than a big team in a short period. So that also changes the sensibility of the project. So that's kind of like how I have found what I tell myself is a meaningful way of making art, basically.
Thank you.
I was thinking about that moment when it was that one-to-one piece digester, and that audience member was like in floods of tears about their thing not being here in 50 years, and perhaps about their own mortality and them not being here in 50 years as from them as well. And it was 2019, so it was like pre-pandemic. And so that experience of sitting there and allowing that person their grief. I mean, we didn't, whatever the person wanted to say, they wanted to say. I mean, I had like 3 very gentle questions, and I kind of let the person speak. And I didn't think of like having any tissues, because I guess I thought I was making quite a gentle piece where you go out and you find something and you take a few steps back from that thing and think about whether it'll still be here. So that was, that kind of shows you the sort of, what you think you're making as an artist, and it kind of follows on from what you're saying, Jakob, is whatever you think you're making, when you put it out into the world, then the world makes something of it, and what it makes of it is actually beyond like the control of what I think. So that kind of agency in allowing things to happen as an artist and activist.
Thank you so much. I guess, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I guess it's also like me thinking sometimes, working as a curator, but also thinking like, you know, the relationships also in terms of like who we are, like in the place where we are as well, thinking about, you know, like who, what the stories that we're telling and like what we prioritize and what we should be working on. I'm just kind of like thinking like, okay, if I have this, if I have this privilege to be where I am, like, and work with the people that I can work with, like how can I, you know, just make space, for example, to tell stories that need telling, which is pretty much what you've been talking about, all of you as well in your work as well, which is really, it makes it really powerful and exciting as well. One thing that I was, we kind of brought up a little bit yesterday in the conversation that we had about sustainability, but I was very interested to discuss that with you as well, is because all of us are working somehow in one way or another with technologies as well, and we are part of like a digital art festival, and you know, a lot of the work that we're doing as well is kind of engaging with like technological worlds. And what you were talking about also, Maya, earlier in your presentation, in terms of like, you know, working with machine learning and thinking about the ethics of like AI and machine learning is something that I've been questioning as well quite a lot and thinking about. And I've been wondering about like, you know, how you might, all of you might be approaching you know, the technologies in terms of like, and how you reframe technology so that they are not, it's not, you know, it doesn't go back to this kind of contradiction in terms of like, we are always like thinking about advanced technologies and like things that we can develop more and more and more and very fast. But how could we think about technologies in different ways, maybe with bringing into the conversation and the frame like other agents as well, like but also thinking about slow technologies or thinking about, you know, like non-using technologies as well. So I'm really interested in this idea, or like, or maybe thinkings that you might have. Like, do you sometimes interrogate like your artistic practice in this way, or do you think like about the use of technologies in different ways? I would love to hear that. In terms of, I'm thinking also, you know, like technologies in like from the perspective of other species as well. So not just how we think them, but also how, you know, other species might be innovating in a way. So I would love to hear your thoughts on in that.
Yeah, I'd love to know how other species are innovating their technologies.
Not technology, but thinking about, you know, like we were saying, for example, yesterday we were talking about silkworms, like, you know, and weaving, and like, you know, there are so many different ways. I was thinking, like, Robertina is talking about a world that we have no connection to, like the oceans and the life that is coming, you know, and creatures that live there, and thinking about, like, for example, when whales, there was like, you know, scientific research to show that how whales were change their patterns, like of like, you know, like to avoid ships that obviously would kill them. And so thinking about intelligence in other species, but also thinking about how do we reframe technology so that it's not just about us, you know, making things very quickly, very fast, and but also, yeah. So how do you deal with that as an artist? Because I'm just thinking, like, you know, how I deal with, how I question it sometimes as a curator, having to, you know, working with digital. So I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts in that.
I think we all have lots to say on this. So
Yeah.
I think it will be helpful if you just tell the names and we.
I mean, so, you know, for example, I think a lot about this. I mean, I hear two questions in your question and they resonate with like two different trajectories. I'm also thinking a lot about, one, of course, is, you know, most digital technologies are incredibly pollutive. And I think over the next 5 years, the narrative and perception of them are going to be a little bit like oil or sustainability. So like being completely 100% virtual in like 5-10 years time, it's going to probably in wider context be somewhat perceived a little similar to like, oh, are you using renewable, or are you running like an old diesel engine? So of course, with like digital technologies themselves, this is something I'm thinking a lot about. Or, you know, like for example, when I make work, like 3 months of the year, my work is just like a camera and a couple of batteries, you know, and it's like working outside a lot. But then another part of it is very heavy, not so much to make my work. It's actually very light. And sometimes what you think takes a lot of the environment is not what actually takes it. But then the actual shows use incredible amount of power for my shows. You know, like they're big. But then on the other hand, you have like large audiences going through. You know, like through a lifetime of my project, maybe I have 100,000 people or something. So it's you're like this kind of map. I'm very curious to map out. And I know that there are like different grants now coming up, or, you know, like really getting insight into that more like just from like a solid scientific environmental perspective. I think that's very interesting to move forward in. And then the other thing with like concept of technology, that's what I mentioned in my presentation too. Like I'm really looking into songs, ways of using the body to make vibrations, or hands, different like forms of using hands gestures. Actually, a lot of us today are not that expressive with our hands to each other, which is kind of funny because I start to talk to this advocate. He's a deaf advocate in the States, and it's like when he uses his hands, it's just like amazing. There's a sensory awareness, sensibility that like, wow, okay. Most of us actually cannot even express ourselves in that complexity like we can with our voice. Or like with the whales, or like this clicking sound I've learned to make to do like echo in a large space. It's like that was inspired by a researcher that basically there are only 22 professional sperm whale researchers in the world, which is kind of fantastic or weird, you know, or a little bit scary as well, given how big, beautiful, a magic creature that is. It's like we watch Jurassic Park, but we have these giant things floating around our planet and we barely pay attention to them. But one of the leading researchers is a language researcher, is not what most of them are, and he has a theory that the large head they have and all this oil is used for their language, and their language is spatial. So they communicate by sending spaces to each other. And then when I think about technologies and how we have this two-dimensional surface and narrative, usually we design experiences, whatever, based on like a story, an idea, a concept, a logic. But like we actually have a tool that we can send, just like sperm whales. We can actually start communicating in spaces to each other and send worlds beyond. But we very rarely do it because we have a paradigm that comes from like a textual, cinematic narrative design principle, right? So like I think a lot about that and looking at, especially sperm whales or singing techniques, sound techniques from the past. Where all this is leading, I don't know, but it's sort of where I feel and sense that these kind of things will become more and more important and of interest to people. I mean, thinking as an artist with audience and so on, like my audience, like people will, there's a curiosity there, I think.
Shall I go next then? So yeah, I mean, I call myself a multidisciplinary artist because digital technologies are one material process that I use. And it just depends on what I'm making. I made a piece in 2020 that was like seeds, earth. It had headphones in it, and it used the people's phones. And there was about planting seeds. So, you know, it just depends what it is I'm working on. In terms of like thinking about the digital technologies that I use, I've tried doing those carbon footprint things for a project to map that out. But I feel like it's deep. Well, obviously that's good to do, and then you can kind of see, you know, how much oil your work, you know, uses. But I think there's also a deeper thing that's important to think about. So when I was making What's Eating Reality, I did an interview with Bhavani Shankar, who used to be at the London School of Economics, talking about you know, in terms of climate change and eating meat. And what he was saying in the interview was like, if you can do 20 to 30% less meat and dairy, that is going to make this, and I forget the statistic, impact on CO2 emissions. So what I've been thinking about during Sustain is what am I using and what is it using up, and is there something I can replace one thing with another? And we had a lot of debates during the program about aesthetics, but that we could spend all afternoon on that, about aesthetics and CO2 emissions. So for me anyway, personally, it's like a balance of what it is I want to create, and then having when I come up with an idea, then just thinking about low carbon art making and this idea. And then, you know, a bit like what Bhavani Shankar was saying about 20 to 30% less, is there something I can substitute? What is the impact of that? I guess it's, you know, I kind of mentioned it before. So thinking about AI in terms of like the ethics, but then also thinking about those massive servers that every time you want to like do like one process, how much CO2 that's using up. So yeah, getting all that in balance. And yeah, absolutely, Jakob, about what you were saying about, say in 10 years, like what will our practices be like? All of that really.
Absolutely, yeah. Robertina, do you want to add anything?
Oh, a lot.
Great.
I think it's something that we all like. I think it's like, especially when you work inside of the field of ecological kind of way of being, it's already important also how to represent that, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm just coming back from, I was just like part of one bigger show at Canarian Islands, where the curators, Blanco de la Torre and Zoran Aric, they even wrote the statements about sustainable way of working inside of the arts, and also which kind of artworks they have been presented. So instead of shipping the artwork there, I went there and I made one new variation together with my collaborator, Gino Šutić, of our project, which speaks about this aquatic chemical water pollutants, especially like pharmaceuticals and so on. And we have been trying to represent it these different ways than just like with the big project which we otherwise showing. So I started also like in the last few years to rethink, you know, like to be more careful which material I'm using. Because yes, I work a lot in digital, but I also have like installations which they have like objects and you know, representation of that also. So it's always this combo then, you know, to rethink if it's the shipping of the big piece more expensive or less expensive, or shall I just do the video / AI variation of it, or, you know, there's always this kind of how to rethink that, you know. Because if I work like with aluminium, for instance, these prices, they increase the prices, and it's one of the most dirtiest materials to work with. You know, that's why I prefer to work with stainless steel, which at least has the possibility to be reused then after the lifespan of one art piece would be done into something else, you know, and so on and so on and so on. So there is lots of different ways how to approach it. I also collaborated last year with Sofia Crespo and Felica McCormick, which they are really excellent artists working a lot in this kind of artificial intelligence and machine learning kind of techniques. So with them, we spoke a lot also about this, how to do the piece that it has, you know, that it can speak about this love to the biodiversity and ecological kind of representation without being too damaging, you know, and it's also, you know, and on the other hand, I think that we all have to be aware to not have the double morale, you know, like don't do this, but then watch Netflix for the whole weekend, you know. So it's always this kind of like, how should we approach this like holistically more, you know, in the way of not just like, because for some while, you know, I'm still flying, and this is very much debatable also, big time. And you know, I try to use as much as possible trains, buses, public transport in general, because I believe into this kind of public kind of uses of common goods, you know, and so on. So it's, as I said, it's a long debate.
Absolutely. And it's something that I guess it was, my question was more like to start, just to kind of think like, how do we deal with these questions, and like, how do we interrogate, like, not just like, of course, the work that we do, but everything that our lifestyles, etc. And it's, I know it is a very complex kind of world as well, but it's but it's really it's something that I guess that we all will be facing even more, and we need to think more in the years to come as well. And it's something that, of course, many artists like yourselves are dealing with in terms of like, how do I continue to produce work? What are the implications? How do I show work, etc. And it's something that we need to be bringing to the bigger players as well, just to think about us. And it's something that I also, my next question, and something that I was wondering as well about, because all of you are like exploring, but also just bring to your work places and that we have, and of course environments that we have either lost connection to, and or that we have no connection with. Like, for example, like Jakob, you were in Berl, you are talking about wetlands and how we have lost, we're losing wetlands more and more, of course, which are really important. But and also Maya, you kind of took us to places that have been heavily altered by human impact and climate change as well. And Robertina, you're kind of working like with a place that the ocean that we definitely have have very little connection to, but also it's very much kind of impacted by human like actions as well. And what I'm thinking is like, do you, I don't know, is it something that you have encountered in your work, or like you're hoping that will become something that art can help even more? I'm just thinking, how do we, because you're creating these incredible experiences for people that are touching, and it can shape somebody's perception about things. But like, how do you think that art could potentially do that at a bigger level, like in terms of like decision making, like government agents or like big corporations, or like touch, like and change and shape people's minds in that place? Or is your work becoming more and more difficult in terms of, as you kind of try to bring like important messages that, and also to kind of help us kind of see where things are going, or engage with like worlds and like ecosystems that we are losing in a way? So I would love to hear about that. Like, what are your hopes, or like maybe you had this already experience in terms of like seeing that there is like hope in terms of like social change, in terms of a bigger change. But I would love to hear your hopes and then challenges that you think that are in terms of, that you find in terms of like working as artists with important issues as you do.
Who wants to start?
I should start now.
Yes, I should start this time. So it's on different levels, like the seed piece that I made. The audience were the people who were just wandering about in the community center, the community garden center. I would say just about everyone who came to that piece had never planted anything before. So during the piece, they plant 3 types of seeds: a mustard seed, which is to do with like a herbal healing, an apple tree seed. Well, they don't plant it, but they put it in to be able to stratify it in their fridge when they get home, and a pea seed, which is representing food. And yeah, people had never planted anything before. And so that is the hope and the change in that kind of small way of how that might touch that person. But then in terms of like other sorts of changes, I think I always think about who my audience is. And for that, the audience was like the everyday person coming to the garden centre, you know, either just to come and have like a break in somewhere green, or they were coming to have a cup of tea or something like that. And yeah, there are different audiences. So I guess like with the piece that was for the Science Museum, which was online, it's going to a completely different audience.
Yeah.
And it's like working in a different way on a kind of different level. I was using like found recordings of those creatures that are in habitats that are becoming very, you know, that creatures that are about to become extinct. So yeah, working on different levels and just depend on different audiences. But I feel like it's quite hard to I always think about like after I've made the work, is this the right place to show the work? Like, is it going to be in the garden centre or is it going to be online? Yeah. And then who is going to come and see it?
Yeah.
And so I guess the hope is in the different ways that it affects the person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess also, yeah, just it's really interesting that you're also trying, you're showing work in like the non-traditional art spaces as well. Like, how do you engage? Which is something that I find is really interesting and exciting in terms of like, you know, seeing at the work of many artists as well. In terms of just going in these spaces that are not creating barriers for people to enter. Jakob, Robertina, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big change. You know, I think for my own work, I mean, it's never really entirely just existed, you know, in like art spaces. And I think more and more art can exist in any space. And I think this is happening in general. And I also think that institutionally, more and more institutions are representing, showing, working with, you know, creators outside of a more conventional concept of who is allowed to be showing in a museum and at institution levels. And then I think like, you know, more like structurally, I think there's a big shift moving, especially with like really even younger artists, where the idea, you know, there's like an older paradigm of one artist building some massive studio and then they get like most of the art commissions, right? This is kind of like, it's still a model that exists, and I think it's a problem. But I think increasingly we're seeing like a decentral way of working with artists in different places, and there is actually really a growing diversity of artists right now showing in different places. You still have the old hierarchies and everything, but I think it's actually really happening now, and the kind of resources primarily still, like, you know, a lot of it goes to some of these big older studios, but I also think less so than in the past. Like, it's more distributed, and I think by nature of doing that, you're going to get a more healthy relationship between, you know, ideas, people, and environments, because it can be more local specific and it can be more relevant where it's shown. Or you can show something really unique from one town, one side of the world, and then suddenly it's on the opposite side of the planet, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, it's more like, for example, like I have a small studio and small team by intention. I could scale it up by making it much bigger, but I just don't really feel like I need to participate by like suddenly mass producing a ton of stuff, you know. So I think like these structures are very inspiring, and I think that will bring some healthy change. And then, I mean, literally, people who saw my show in Berlin, like I would receive emails and texts from people that were like, suddenly they're like, oh, I'm out seeing the swamps, I'm out in the wetlands, from people I've never met. By really, I mean, a lot of people. And that was moving. But then other works are like, someone would send me an email that they saw another piece and they were like, oh, this was really emotional. It made me think about my dead dog. Or like a veterinarian literally in China wrote me that after going to the festival and seeing my work, right? A completely different piece. So with art, it's sort of, you don't really know where it goes, but I do have a general sensibility that it's becoming more like a flat terrain. Or it could be. There's probably some people that just want to preserve an old structure, but I think that will create it better. And I also think that like at big company levels, there is a lot of changes happening.
Yeah.
I think if you look 5-10 years ahead, I mean, a lot of companies that 5 years ago maybe say they wouldn't go renewable are doing it now by like consumer necessity from like more like a market perspective. Yeah, I don't know.
Great, thank you. Robertina?
I would say that, you know, I'm one of the artists which I'm mostly working with public money. And this is absolutely different dynamics, as Jakob was also now saying. And it was kind of decision which happened, you know, also. I was just recently part of a bigger European Commission, which was called Starts for Water. And it was really interesting to be also part of that, where a few different artists, we have been working on different localities, on different challenges, but then also dealing with this water managements and in general ideas also. But what I want to say beyond that is like many times in my artworks, I develop also, like there is an art piece, which is kind of a center of it as a outcome, but then also like with Gino Šutiš, one of the scientists I collaborate a lot, we wrote also some science papers. And this is absolutely different audience than I would have like in the art gallery, but sometimes they're also mixing. I don't like to have these boundaries of representations. I do also some master classes at different universities, which I call them aqua formations. And this is this kind of coin which I put together, and I really like it because, you know, it's aqua forming, how we are changing the waters inside out also with our presence, but what we could do to change it back, you know. And through that, I kind of developed a few different methodologies of, I call it empathic strategies, how we can reconnect also. Or just think together, because many times, especially with younger generation, I see there is this eco anxiety is present, you know, because exactly how we spoke before about this, like, yes, we are thinking how to move our practices in different ways, but how our lives or in general, but, you know, with younger generation, sometimes I feel that, you know, if I bombard them too much with all the facts, which is like happening, then we all start to feel like very anxious, you know. Which can be good for us to move further then, but it can be also very frustrating because sometimes then you have feeling you can't do a lot, you know, and then it's always this question to navigating that. And yeah, I think that definitely beyond, you know, like especially with workshops, you know, like in Madrid, I had like one big workshop for 500 people one day at the river. So of course we did develop the system that we don't come with everybody at the same point, you know, so we distributed the thing, you know, and so on. So it also, many times it's important how to think and represent what we are showing into the world also.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it should be like a, you know, like when you think, I was asked recently to film a little video on like human rights, like an idea for human rights. And I was like, okay, you know, there's so many like structural ideas already at play. Like you were also mentioning Robertina, like, you know, there's so much like things that needs to happen. There's so many facts you can bombard people with, but I think there should almost be like a human right to have these like spaces of imagination or have like freedom to imagine, because like, you know, pretty much I became an artist because I was moving around with my mom and lived on like countryside in different places, and then video games came along right when I was like a teenager to like a certain level of complexity, and the imagination blew my mind, and suddenly I felt like, oh wow, there are people like imagining creating some worlds and stories that are so far outside of what the community context I was around could allow for, right? And that changed my life. That completely, like, I played maybe like one specific game, and it changed my life. I was like, okay, this is so fascinating. So like, I think it's also important to still have value in, you know, these like spaces of imagination, of encounters, so people can see, even just experiencing, wow, you can actually make a living or create a way of being and working that is outside of the more like strong narratives, you're the wall you hit with all the time and increasing it, right? It's going to be hard imagining or creating some new worldviews if you're hit by this like wall of facts at all times.
Yeah, this is also blocking you, you know, like this
Yeah.
is at least my experience also when I speak with public. I don't know how it's for you, Maya and Jakob, but you know, for me it's like this. I really try not to be a preacher.
Yeah.
I really try to kind of co-create together new narratives with the ones which they want to, of course, come into that discussion, because, you know, not everybody is always in the mood to even go there. And I was just recently in Galapagos, you know, like, which is one of these like really pristine natures. And I have to say that in one hand, yes, it was amazing to be there and be able to be so near to all these various creatures which they're still living there. But on the other hand, I was feeling so, you know, when you are in natural parks and we really enjoy them, but then we always forget, you know, that nature is also like with us in the cities or wherever we are, you know, and it's also this kind of like, yeah, so.
Yeah, absolutely. We do forget that we are, part of nature. Yeah. We totally forget about that. I'm just aware of time, and I don't know if anyone has any final kind of comments, but yeah, I think you put it so well also, Jakob, because that's exactly how I was thinking about how I'm seeing like your work. It is like enabling these spaces of imagination and like allowing people to see things differently, and definitely not in a way that is preaching, but also in a way that, you know, create like these spaces for breathing as well. That's exactly how I'm saying like your practices. So thank you so much, and please continue to do this amazing work. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you, Maya, Robertina, and Jakob, for being here and for sharing your work. And also thank you to Patchlab for giving us space for this conversation. And and I hope to have a chance to see you in person as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.